All right, good morning. Welcome to today's meeting. This is the October 22nd or October 1st, 2022 edition of Talking Baseball, presented by the Bob Davis SABR chapter. Our next Talking Baseball meeting will be Saturday, November 5th at 9 a.m. and our speaker will be SABR member Dan Joseph, author of Baseball's Greatest What If, the story and tragedy of Pistol Pete Reeser. This book won SABR's 2022 Ron Gabriel Award. And if you have questions for our speaker during today's presentation, please put them in the chat box and we'll get to them after the talk and probably just go to live questions at that point. In our meetings, we tend to focus on books by SABR members, and it's always a treat for us when we can feature a SABR member who's a member of our local Bob Davis chapter, and that's the case today. So today's speaker is the relatively new SABR member, Michael Ortman. Michael graduated from Notre Dame, where he says he spent less time in class than in the sports information department and at the student newspaper and radio station. He spent most of the past 40 years as a senior executive in sports marketing and television working for Comcast, and he was a finalist in the Washington Post's 2012 exhaustive search for DC's greatest sports fan. Michael and his wife now split time between Maryland and Florida. Florida is where he currently is. So Mike, what was it like riding out Hurricane Ian, and how are you doing this morning?
Thank you for asking. It was scary. I've got to tell you, it was our first. We just retired early this year, and it was we deliberately went inland on purpose. We bought a house outside Orlando, grandkid bait, to avoid hurricanes. But this one was massive, as we all know. I gather you're feeling the remnants of it in the mid-Atlantic today, a little bit of rain, but the wind and the tornadoes and battening down the hatches for a couple of days was a bit scary. I really feel for our friends down the Gulf Coast. They really got hammered.
Okay.
You said, I think you said originally the estimated track was going to have you 4 miles south of the track, but then you lucked out.
A couple of days earlier, the track was literally going right a couple of miles north of our house. It ultimately wound up passing about 50 miles south. So we dodged the worst of it, but neighboring counties are in bad shape. We're just very, very fortunate.
Well, we're glad you're safe, and thoughts are currently with everyone that's suffering there and in its path, because it's definitely going to do some flooding as it comes up the East Coast.
That's right.
So Mike, why don't you tell us about your book and get started?
Sure. Well, thank you, Pete. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, SABR. As you acknowledged, I'm relatively new to SABR. How I came to be a SABR member is an interesting story. So Ken Rosenthal tweeted about my book back in April, and I got an email shortly thereafter from a baseball fan in San Diego who had been bombarded with emails from his friends saying, "Dude, we didn't know you wrote a book." And he's like, "What are you talking about?" Indeed, this gentleman's name is Michael Ortman, and he's a big baseball fan. So I happened to be in LA visiting my daughter in June and drove down to San Diego for my first game ever at Petco Park. And we're chatting about baseball in general. And he says, "Well, you know, since this whole SABR thing, things have really taken off and it's gotten great." And I said, "What do you mean this SABR thing? I know of SABR.org. I use the site religiously while researching my book, but what are you talking about?" He said, "Well, there's chapters and you can join." And I have to tell you, my perception of SABR was that it was this incredibly impressive society of baseball experts and sports writers, not for a regular fan like me. But when my doppelganger, Michael Ortman in San Diego, said that there's a chapter, I immediately came home, joined SABR, joined the Bob Davis chapter, the Babe Ruth chapter, the Central Florida chapter, signed up for SABR 50. I'm all in, but my late arrival at the altar, if you will, was more out of ignorance than a lack of interest. So love it. Had a blast at SABR 50 in Baltimore. It happened to be in my backyard. We saw the house in Ellicott City and got to meet a lot of people. I'll show you some pictures a bit later. I bring up that long preamble because my book, opening day, 50 for 50, was about 50 days, 50 games, but more importantly, 50 stories. I'll show you in a few minutes. But I would say it is not a typical SABR book in that, as I wandered around the exhibit hall at SABR 50 this year and saw all the companies that publish baseball books. I wish I'd known. This is my first book. I didn't know what I was doing. I made a lot of mistakes along the way, but it certainly has worked out well. But it was my impression as I look at the variety of books, and I picked up a few. I picked up my friend Rick Vaughn, who used to be the PR director of the Orioles, wrote a book about 100 years of baseball in St. Petersburg, Florida. That's a really narrow topic. He does a terrific job. It is a very interesting read about all the Hall of Famers that did spring training at one time in their career in St. Petersburg, but you get my point. It's a very specific topic. I picked up, speaking of Bob David's chapter members, Paul Schimonelli wrote a book about Roy Sievers. Again, a very narrow topic, one player, terrific book about one of the greatest players in Washington Senators history, but really narrow. And then I really enjoyed, and old Senators fans will enjoy, the long-awaited Time for Expansion Baseball at SABR 50. Maxwell Cates presented the book, but it's a deep dive on all 14 expansion teams that came into baseball over a 50-year period. And his presentation was about ranking those expansion drafts and how they did. And I was fascinated to find out that the Washington Senators, the ones that left for Texas, finished second in this ranking because of the life cycle of the players that came out of that draft and then ultimately acquired via trade, or how they performed using the metric of wins above replacement. He was using that to gauge the overall success of that draft. And the Senators finished number 2. So I was really excited. So these are all narrow topic books. I set out to do something a little different. It's a storybook, a book of stories. I've enjoyed this game for my entire life, as all of you have, and had the blind luck, frankly, of attending opening day every single year for 50 years. And so from those games and from my experiences in baseball, a little bit, I was in the business for about 10 of those 50 years, cobbled together an awful lot of fun stories that I share in the book. So if there are any preliminary questions, I'm going to go ahead and grab the screen, Pete, if that's all right, and take us through a few slides. Now, where did the screen share go? There it is. If you can confirm everybody can see that. We good?
Yeah, we're good. Thanks.
Okay, fantastic. So I thought it'd be helpful just to give you a little bit about me, more importantly about the book. It's got kind of a unique format. Some of the sources and research that we did in putting it together to cobble these stories and give them credibility and detail that would make it fun, entertaining for readers. Some of the innovations that we embraced as we brought this book to market, and different themes and topics if you group them together. I'll tell you that I did not set out to have these buckets of topics and themes, but when it was over, I said, how can I organize this book better as I explain it to people? I'll show you that. The reviews have been beyond my imagination. I told my wife many times as she endured this process for 18 months of writing and listening to each chapter, I said, I don't know if anybody's going to buy this or read it, but I'm going to have a lot of fun writing it. And I certainly did. But when it came to market in April, the response was shocking and impressive and exciting and all that. So I'll talk more about that in a minute. Pete asked, why don't you pick your 3 favorites? I said, I will, and we'll get to those, but there's something in here for everybody, even Red Sox fans, Walter. And then we'll open it up for questions. So me, I'm a 3rd-generation native Washingtonian. As mentioned earlier, yes, I was DC's greatest sports fan, or number 2 in that competition. That was a lot of fun, and we poked fun at me in the book about that. Went to Annunciation, grew up in upper Northwest Washington, D.C., went to St. John's High School, same school my dad went to in the 1930s, and then on to Notre Dame, whereas was mentioned earlier, I spent more time in sports than in the classroom, but that's okay. No one's ever asked me for my GPA since. I flirted with sports writing in high school and college, but really didn't have the guts to really make that a career. So I went into sports entertainment, PR and marketing in the 80s, worked for the legendary Charlie Brotman, who earned a chapter in the book. Charlie, as many of you know, was the voice of opening day at Griffith Stadium in the late 50s, RFK in the 70s, and even a cameo at Nationals Park when we moved there in 2008. And he also was the voice of the inaugural parades in Washington, D.C., from Harry Truman all the way up through Biden, with one hiccup in there. I was one of the original employees at Home Team Sports back in 1984. That network later became known as Comcast Sportsnet, now NBC Sports Washington, and I think it's about to undergo another name change to Monumental Sports now that Ted Leonsis owns the whole thing. But that was an entrepreneurial time back in the 80s. And yes, I did work for the World Wrestling Federation for a time, probably the topic for another book another day. I retired in March of this year from Comcast Cable, where I spent the last 25 years in cable TV marketing and operations. I am married to the same woman for 39 wonderful years. Kate and I have 18 children, daughters-in-law, and grandchildren. 6 kids, 4 daughters-in-law, and 8 grandkids. And that's why we're in Orlando, to attract them here to enjoy the theme parks. And as I mentioned earlier, I've been a SABR member since June of 2022. I'm a relative rookie. So more importantly, let's move on to the meat of this, about the book. So we'll talk about the format, the innovations I mentioned a minute ago, the research and sources that we drew from, and some of the themes and topics. I should pause and give you a side story about the cover of that. I self-published this book. I didn't use a big publishing company, and you have to do an awful lot yourself. And one of the self-publishing companies came to me. I had to change horses midstream, which was a nightmare, but I asked them to go find a good cover photo, and they came back with a bunch of garbage. I said, no, it's got to be opening day, you know, flag on the field and players on the field and sunshine and full house. And the first iteration were these innocuous empty stadiums. They said that's all they could get the rights to. The second one included a batch, including one from Citizens Bank Park. Are you kidding me? No. So I went out on Facebook. I said, give me one day. I'll find something. Went on Facebook, did a crowdsource. A volunteer firefighter in Southern Maryland sent me this picture. His son's name is Bryce. It tells you what his fan allegiance are. He's just quite a Nationals fan. And he was so thrilled to provide this picture and have it on the cover of the book. But that's just the way fans are. And it was really neat to meet him and his family on opening day this year. So about the book, this is the table of contents. This is it. It's 50 years. It's 50 chapters. Yes, there are 50 games, but as we all know, it's just a regular season game, not an all-star game, not a playoff game. But in some cases, the game was the story, but that was rare. And 50 stories, the opportunity to kind of cobble together 50 years of baseball history. My wife made the comment early on, this is kind of like chicken soup for the soul. It's 50 stories that you can read in any order. And while I originally set out with that in mind, I will tell you that over the course of writing this, it's not 50 stories you can read in any order. Yes, Red Sox fans may want to read about Caray or the Red Sox games, or the White Sox fans may want to read about the White Sox chapters. That's fine. But it really became also the story of a little boy who lost his baseball team when he was 11 years old, when the Senators left in 1971, and then celebrated getting them back when the Nationals arrived in 2005. But this is the way it was laid out, and this is the table of contents. More about how these chapters come together later. Each chapter has 2 parts. The game, which you see on the left, this is a sample chapter from 1971. Every time I talk about 1971, many old Senators fans say, that was the Vida Blue game. That's correct, it was. Vida Blue was pitching for the Oakland Athletics that day, and he was beaten 8-0 by Dick Bosman of the Senators. But the opening day center fielder that day for the Washington Senators was Curt Flood. And this is the beginning of several chapters that tell the story of the journey to free agency that the younger fans today have no context for. But it was, fans of our age remember that it was 25 years of lockouts and strikes, and people like Curt Flood and Dave McNally that had the courage to stand up and say, wait a minute, we deserve the same freedoms that other workers have, and led to a lot of labor strife. The fans certainly paid a price for that, but that journey is a big part of a few of the first 25 chapters of the book. So there's the game, there's the story. But we had to go a different direction to really bring to life things like pictures and box scores. People say, we need the box scores of all 50 games. Yeah, I get that, but that would add 50 more pages of cost to the book for fans, and I want to try to keep this as low cost as possible. So we built a companion website. My daughter-in-law is amazing at this. So she built this site, openingday5050.com, where you can find the box score of every game. You can find photos, if I have them available, personal photos from those experiences or those stories. When appropriate, even tap the SABR biography project. And there's links to the biographies of the players I write about, if they're appropriate. There's about a dozen or so of those. There's news and reviews on the site as well. And during COVID, if you wanted to eat in a restaurant, you had to figure out how to use a QR code. We put a QR code at the end of every chapter that would take a reader of the book directly to that year's page on the website. So if you really want to see that box score, who else was playing in that game, or Do you have any pictures of that kind of bring credibility to your story? Yeah, in many cases, that's what that's there for. So that's the companion site that goes along with the book. Where did I get all this stuff? People have asked me a lot, did you have a diary? Did you take notes? The answer is no. I didn't even think I was going to be writing this book until I started flirting with the idea. A lot of people saying, you want to write a book? You want to write a book? Yeah, we all hear that about certain stories we tell. But I didn't have any notes or a diary. But in about 2015, when I took my grandson to opening day, Max Scherzer's first game with the Nationals, I went home and I said, I better make a list. So I went to baseballreference.com and I started digging game by game, year by year, game by game, with all the pertinent details. Where was the game played? What was the outcome? What was the attendance? What was the weather? What future Hall of Famers were in uniform that day, et cetera. And started to bring back some memories. I went to some newspaper archives, especially the Baltimore Sun and Washington Post. I should pause there. We are so blessed in the mid-Atlantic US to have had some of the great baseball writers of all time in the last 50 years in our footprint, with people like Tom Boswell and Tim Kirchin, who did some time at the Evening Star in Washington and then the Baltimore Sun before going on to fame at ESPN. Ken Rosenthal was his successor as the beat reporter for the Orioles in Baltimore. And that's just an amazing group of people to draw from. So they kept popping up in these newspaper archive searches I would do, and many, many others. And this would bring back more memories. Oh yeah, now I remember that day and that game, and the stories would come together with even more detail. Going on YouTube, it's amazing what you can find out there. I will tell you, the one YouTube clip that was most inspiring and meaningful to me was early on in the process when I just said, Washington Senators 1970, opening day. And up comes an audio recording preserved by Ernie Kiger, who many of you know, of Ron Manchin and Shelby Woodfield calling the opening day 1970. It was just, wow, listening to him talking, it just brought back a flood of memories of what it was like to go to bed at night with a radio under your pillow and turned on low so your parents would know you were up past bedtime. Did several interviews, most of them with friends that I was there with, to ask what they remembered that maybe I didn't. But I also had some really other cool interviews with some players and broadcasters and announcers and others, members of the media, that I'll talk about more when we talk about my favorite chapters. And then other online resources I mentioned earlier, SABR.org, baseballalmanac.com had some great stuff, and tons of other resources. So that's what I used for putting this together. If you step back and take the chapters out of chronological order and drop in with how you bucket the stories, to think of it this way. And again, I didn't set out to do it this way, but it kind of came together. Certain chapters lended themselves to tell a story about a specific player, which we were able to do. Some of them really helped bring together that journey to free agency story I mentioned earlier. So you can't tell that story without Curt Flood, and there he was in center field on opening day 1971. Opening day starter for the Orioles in 73 was Dave McNally, who, as we know, was instrumental in the arbitration case that came along a couple of years later. Reggie Jackson was an opening day holdout for the Orioles in 76. People forget he had 1 year, it was a great career with the Orioles, and that was the story of 76. My dad and I got lost in Baltimore in 1974. We asked Boog Powell for directions, and he told us how to get back to Washington. Carl Yastrzemski hit the game winner on opening day in 1975 and went to Notre Dame, so I couldn't not tell that story. But also, Red Sox fans will appreciate that was also the first game of Tony Conigliero's second attempt at a comeback. And he hit a home run that day, which was just a heartwarming moment throughout all of Red Sox Nation. Al Bumbry and I recreated a photo op last year. One of the two of us in 1973, and one of the two of us dressed almost the same 48 years later at the same spot. He's the topic of chapter 1978. I embarrassed myself once in front of his mother. That was a funny story. You can't talk about this era unless you have a chapter about the guy I spent 19 opening days with, Cal Ripken Jr., and a lot of good personal stories there. Mike Hargrove is the guy I remember as a player and a manager. I couldn't help but write about him in 2000. I was a big Texas Rangers fan. People say, wait a minute, you're a Texas Rangers fan, but the Senators. I, unlike a lot of people, couldn't trade in my Washington Senators for the Orioles at first. I stuck with my team, even though they were half a country away. And so whenever the Rangers came to Baltimore, I was there. In fact, that's a great topic of chapter 1977 when they met the Orioles on opening day. I brought a banner that day that said, "Go Senators," and hung it off the mezzanine The next day on the front page of the sports section of the Washington Star, my banner, go Senators. Don't hang banners in stadiums anymore, but we could back in the 70s. Mariano Rivera was in uniform for the Yankees in the opening day of 2002 when the Yankees began their 100th season. Where better than in Babe Ruth's hometown. Mariano had just blown Game 7 of the World Series the previous October, but still loved and adored throughout Yankee fandom and baseball. But he also helped me finish the story of the evolution of Jackie Robinson Day, which we talk about in two places. Chapter 1987, when baseball botched the 40th anniversary of Jackie's debut. And then ultimately in 97, when on the 50th anniversary, they got right, retired his number. And Mariano was the last player wearing number 42. And the friendship that formed over the years between him and Jackie's widow, Rachel, is remarkable. A great, very inspiring story. Alfonso Soriano, one of those one and done players with the Nationals, but that was kind of the story of his career, and seized 06 to tell that story, the year he made the All-Star team. Ryan Zimmerman, no better opening day than christening Nationals Park with a walk-off home run by the face of the franchise. And that was the day he was also dubbed Mr. Walk-Off. We'll talk more about that. And if he's Mr. Walk-Off, then Bryce Harper is Mr. Opening Day. His penchant for hitting home runs on opening day was extraordinary. Even when the Nationals opened one year in Atlanta, he hit a home run on opening day. Even after he became a Philly, his first game back in Washington after signing with the Phillies, he hits a home run. So just had to get that story in there. The first 25 of these 50 years littered by work stoppages, lockout strikes, et cetera, many opportunities to tell those stories. Members of the media that had encounters, I sat behind. Some of you will remember David Israel. He was the biggest sports writer of the day in the late 70s, early 80s, until he abruptly retired from the craft at the age of 30 to become a Hollywood writer and producer. Sat behind David. More about him when we get to one of my favorite chapters. I was at Harry Caray's first game as the announcer for the Cubs, his first game at Wrigley Field. During college, my streak detoured through Chicago when I wound up going to that game. So of course, 82 was about Harry Caray. We talked about Charlie Brotman earlier, that great announcer. Ken Rosenthal. One thing I found in going through newspaper archives, every single year, some local columnist wrote an inspiring, wonderful piece about the specialness of opening day. And the best one was Ken Rosenthal on that particular day. So I quoted him very liberally, and he obviously appreciated it. He tweeted about it. Some of you were probably at opening day 2009 when Jerome Hrushka, the stadium announcer, informed us that Harry Callis, the voice of the Phillies, had died suddenly of a heart attack in the press box on opening day. Had to write that story that day. Phillies fans have told me that is by far the best chapter in the book. And it was a very special for a different reason I'll get to later. And John McNamara, not the manager of the Red Sox, but John McNamara, one of the 5 victims at the Annapolis Gazette shooting in 2018, was my best friend in high school. And he and I connected on opening day 2010, and I'm able to tell the story of John McNamara in that chapter. A lot of baseball history we've talked about Jackie Robinson Day, new ballparks, Oriole Park, Comiskey Park. I saw 5 different presidents throughout the first pitch 11 times over that span. The presidential opener used to be a much bigger deal in Washington, but that's a topic of a story. Complete games, whatever happened to them? They're gone just about. They're very rare, almost as rare as a no-hitter nowadays. And so we talk a lot about that in chapter 91. Oriole Park, we mentioned the expansion of baseball was getting frustrating as a DC baseball fan. We lived without a team for 33 years while 6 other teams were born in other places. The steroid era, I kind of arbitrarily picked 2003 for 2 reasons. It's kind of the unofficial halfway mark of the steroid era. If you think it began roughly in 88 when the Bash brothers took the A's to the World Series, all the way up to 2018 when Robinson Cano had to sit out half a season and cost him $10 million in salary. That kind of, it's certainly not over. There's certainly still players using it. We know Fernando Tatis and others, but it's certainly not what it was in 03 when baseball finally began testing for performance enhancing drugs. That was the year. And the most emotional chapter for me and for many of us was 05 when baseball came back. And then a lot of other goofy fun. I tried to make this fun and entertaining, give people laughs. I talked about my banner. My buddy and I got caught on TV by his dad back in Maine because he was watching the game, the Red Sox White Sox game on TV, and he got caught skipping finals. Why Country Boy is so loved in Baltimore. It came back on opening day, 1994, after a brief hiatus. My son's peanut allergy, the orange carpet, nice ritual in Baltimore, the great ritual in Washington of the president's race. Teddy finally won at the end of the 2012 season, and some baseball superstitions, including same seats. Of course, I violated that rule on opening day 2015. And as my grandson and I were heading for the exits, Max Scherzer's no-hitter went out the window. Bad day. There are plenty of news clippings and reviews of the book that we've captured on the website on opening day 50/50. But as I mentioned, when Ken Rosenfeld tweeted about it, this book, just, I can't tell you what it suddenly feels like, your first book you've ever written. You don't know what to expect. And it's a bestseller according to Barnes & Noble and Amazon among baseball history books the first month out. So very honored to have that happen back then. And some pretty important people have read it and commented on it. People like Cal Ripken Jr., Mike Kozer, who hosts the Lost Ballparks podcast, which if you haven't ever listened to his podcast, I cannot recommend it highly enough for SABR members. It's just terrific. What Mike works so hard to bring to life the memories of baseball past with audio clips to make any conversation sound great. And he did a special opening day edition of his podcast on this book. I was interviewed on the MLB Network, and Harold Reynolds wrapped it up by saying, "Mike, this is awesome. This is your contribution to baseball." I am so honored and humbled to hear words like that from someone as noted as Harold. And Tim Kirchin even did a cover blurb for me. Got to see him at SABR 50, but he's just a terrific, terrific guy if you've ever met Tim. And he said the book just warmed his heart, and that was kind of the goal. All right, Pete, you asked for 3 favorite chapters. I'm going to start with 1981. We called it our Olympic moment. So David Israel wrote for the Washington Evening Star, or the Chicago Sun-Times, then the Washington Evening Star, and ended his career at the Chicago Tribune. At the age of 29, David was a syndicated columnist, which was as good as it got in those days. He didn't double as a TV announcer if you were a great columnist. That meant his columns would not only appear in the Chicago Tribune, but in many other papers across the country. He was covering the Olympic Games for the Tribune in Lake Placid, covering the Olympic hockey team. And they famously tell reporters in the press box all the time, there's going to be any cheering in the press box. No cheering in the press box today. And David Israel famously stood up and turned around to his colleagues and said, "But tonight, we're going to make an exception." And he was right. Because when the U.S. beat the Russians to advance to the gold medal game, even the press were cheering. It was a very emotional day. And if you ask anyone that was there, any reporter, it was the most significant sporting event they ever covered. Well, here we are 15 months later on opening day, sitting right behind David Israel. What the heck is he doing in the stands? Why is he not in the press box? He drunk out of his mind, as were his friend. They were having a good time, but great, but it was a mystery. It was a mystery for 40 years. More on that in a second. So the very first pitch of the game, David Israel stands up, just like he had done 15 months earlier, and yells at Ross Baumgartner, whose first pitch of the game was a ball, first pitch of the game, and says, "Throw a strike, you bum." Very funny moment that Craig and I remembered for the rest of our lives. I come to find out, after stalking David Israel for 18 months through social media, he finally reaches out to me, and he barely remembers the day, but it turns out it was his last day in Chicago. And this was his going away party, hosted by, among others, Bill Veeck, who had just sold the White Sox to Jerry Reinsdorf and the Einhorn a few months earlier. They went out to dinner that night, et cetera, et cetera. I had ended the original draft of the chapter with something like, because David later went to work for Peter Ueberroth as his chief of staff when Peter Ueberroth was running the Olympic game, the 1984 Olympics. This is before he became commissioner of baseball. And I said something like, there's no record of how David reacted when he heard the Russians were going to boycott the 1984 Olympics. He probably said something like, "Go ahead and strike, you bums." Ha ha, cute little ending. He writes back and said, "Actually, there is a record. I was at the United Nations that morning with Peter Ueberroth kicking off the cross-country Olympic torch relay. And Peter called the office when he learned of the news the Russians weren't coming. And he got a private plane to take the two of us to Washington, D.C., where he and I met with Michael Deaver and President Reagan. And the four of us sat down and hatched a plan to keep a half a dozen Soviet satellite countries in the Olympic Games. Wow. This silly little chapter just became very much more credible and impactful by getting that input from David. So definitely one of my favorite chapters. I mentioned earlier the loss of Harry Kalas. Harry transcended baseball. He transcended Philadelphia. He was a voice of NFL films. He did TV commercials for soup and trucks, and he was just larger than life and had a voice that was just incredible. So I reached out to Jerome Hrushka, who was the stadium announcer at Nationals Park, to ask him to recreate for me his memory of what it was like to break the news to 40,000 people. And he said, Mike, I'll do you one better. No one's ever asked me this before, but when I became the stadium announcer for the Nationals in 2006, I was the youngest stadium announcer in baseball. I always wanted to be a baseball announcer. I have recordings of myself calling Yankees games, and I was 6 years old. So to get this job was a dream come true. And Harry Kalas was an idol. So for 3 years, whenever the Phillies would come to town, he and I would have dinner together. He was a father figure to me. And on opening day 2009, we longer than normal production meeting because it was opening day. And I go out in the hall after the meeting, and there's a little commotion down the hall. And I asked my boss, what's going on? He said, one of their announcers, medical issue. And Jerome knew it was Harry. And Jerome sprints down the hall. Paramedics aren't there yet. He sees Harry on the ground, drops to his knees, and if you know Jerome, he's an Eagle Scout, starts performing chest compression on Harry Kalas. We all know Harry didn't make it. An hour later, they hand Jerome a script that he has to read to 40,000 people, letting them know that this father figure in his life had passed away. And Jerome had just been with him. And it was clearly the hardest thing he ever had to do. And it was difficult for the Phillies players, and it was difficult for the Phillies announcers and Harry's colleagues. But even the Nationals offered the Phillies the opportunity to postpone the game. And the Nationals and the Phillies said, thank you, but no, this is what Harry would want, let's play. But really special chapter when and especially if you were there, you know what I'm talking about. And then finally, this won't be a surprise, but when baseball came back to Washington, D.C., there was no more special moment for me personally in the memoir side of this book than when baseball came back. And what a great job they did with the pregame ceremony, having Charlie Brotman do the announcing, having Joe Grisenda hand the baseball from that last awful day in 1971 to President Bush to throw out the first pitch, to introduce so many former Senators players one by one, Chuck Hinton and Eddie Brinkman and Dick Bosman, and then saving the best for last. My hero as a kid, maybe many of yours. Pete, I know we had dinner last week and there were four of us, and I asked, who was your favorite player? It was Frank Howard, Frank Howard, Frank Howard. Yeah, and Frank Howard, they saved the best for last, and he limped out to left field. I mean, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. We had tickets 4 rows from the roof, but we were just happy to be there. And it was a really special day. So those are my favorite chapters, but I gotta tell you, the favorite part of this whole book has been, I started to talk about it earlier, what happened back in April when it became really popular and got a lot of attention. I was able to make the rounds and give copies to people or do some interviews. Phil Wood, who you see in the upper left-hand corner there, was read every chapter along the way. I didn't want to publish a book and have some factual historical error in there that one of you would catch and damage the credibility of the whole book. So I really wanted Phil involved. He was very helpful. I did a book signing up in Baltimore a few weeks ago, and he interviewed me and then let me try on his Nationals World Series ring. It was just so awesome. Tom Davis, who many of you know from Orioles telecast all these years. I went to give a copy of the book to Tom Lavero and to Kevin Sheehan at a cigar fundraising event for the DC Grays. And I hid their books in the corner of the room. And when one of them arrived, I said, just a minute, I'll go get your book. And I walk over, and there's a table with 2 people sitting at it. And my books are in the corner, the top right of this slide. You see a picture there. And when I realized who the 2 people were, Davey Martinez and Mike Rizzo, I realized that Kevin Sheehan and Tom Lavero were not going to get copies of my book tonight because Mike wanted one and Davey wanted one. And I had the pleasure of signing Davey Martinez's book thanks for the epilogue. Because the last opening day of the book, the last opening day of my streak was opening day 2019, lost to the Mets, but you can't end the book there. When you know what happened at the end of that season, had to write an epilogue, and it's life lessons according to Davey. And so that was a real special moment in the journey since the book was published. On the left, you see Kevin Brown, who's the play-by-play voice of the Orioles on Masson. He's got a copy. The kid's got to get ready for opening day next year. It's nice to see Tim Kirchin at SABR 50, who I've communicated with a lot recently, but I had not seen him in person for a long time. Kurt Flood's widow, Judy Pace, was at SABR. It was great to see her, and she was thrilled to get a copy. I was at opening day in Philadelphia this year with no expectations at all, but ran into Greg Luzinski, who's got a barbecue place in center field, and I was at his first opening day with the White Sox in 1981, so he was glad to get a copy of the book as well. The young man in the bottom right corner is Harry Callis's son. Kane Callis sings the national anthem on opening day in Philadelphia and has been doing it every year since 2016. So I stayed, and that's Harry's statue behind me. Harry, I gave the book to Kane, and I told him, I expressed my condolences, and he wanted one, so I sent it to him much later. Bottom left, Boog Powell. I told you my dad and I asked him for directions in '74 and got home somehow. And then you see a picture right there of 48 years apart of me and Al Bunbury. It was terrific. Al Bunbury had an interesting point about opening day. He said, remember, it's the only day of the regular season where every player on both teams get introduced. And it was nice. Opening day as a player was terrific. Baltimore fans were great. I got introduced. It was all fun. He said, but the best opening day I remember was when I came back to Baltimore as a coach for the Boston Red Sox. And I got a bigger ovation than Cal Ripken or Frank Robbins. And I came back to the dugout, and my players, I'm their first base coach, never seen anything like it. They said I never get that kind of welcome in Boston. But here, it was nice to see that the fans of Baltimore still like it. But by far, the highlight of this whole journey is that picture bottom left middle. Someone gave me Frank Howard's phone number, and I called it and left a message. And a week later, I get this voicemail. I get this pop on my phone. It says Frank Howard, and my hands were shaking. And I said, Mike Ortman, and this booming voice on the other end says, Mike, this is Frank Howard. How are you? Oh, just an amazing moment. Told him about the book. He invited me out to the house, and I went and delivered one. His son-in-law was very gracious, took that picture. That is just a true treasure. So, book's been a great, fun journey. The reviews have been very good from people that enjoy the stories. It's not a terribly deep or sophisticated book, but it touches an awful lot of baseball history in a fun way over 50 years. It is now available. It was not fully distributed in April, which was a little frustrating. Amazon didn't even get it up until the third week of April, but nonetheless, it's now available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and other online retailers, both paperback, ebook, and the audiobook read by yours truly. So whatever floats your boat, hope it interests you and you'll enjoy it as much as I did putting it together and talking about it today. So thank you. And thank you, Pete, and everybody else for listening. And I'll be glad to answer questions.
Michael, that's a great story, great series of stories, quite an experience. So as your streak continued, you said the book went through 2019, but have you continued your streak? And is it, are you starting a new one?
I'm starting a new one, a different kind of one. So look, none of us got to go to opening day in 2020. Sure. Because we all watched on TV as Dr. Fauci threw that awful pitch on ESPN in primetime when the Nationals played the Yankees. It was the end. And a lot of people said, well, that one doesn't count. No one got to go. It does count. And it was 50, and it was, my team ended on top, and it was just the right time. It was okay. If I'm going to do another 50, though, I'm going to have to gang them up. So this year I went to 3 opening days. I went to one in Baltimore, one in Washington, and one in Philadelphia, as I mentioned a minute ago. So we'll see if there's another book to be had in a more condensed fashion. Because if I'm going to do another 50, either I have to live to about 110 or cram in 3 or 4 a year. So we'll see how it goes. I did, when I was in San Diego with my namesake, Michael Ortman, I also met and had dinner with a fan who managed to keep his opening day streak alive. He has been to every one of the Padres' 53 opening days. home openers.
Wow.
He got to go in 2020 because of a condo owner outside Petco Park who knew of his streak and invited him over because he wanted to keep it alive. So he was actually there on opening day 2020. So there's a picture of me somewhere down on bended knee paying homage to a guy who's got a streak longer than mine.
That's a great story. For your times in Chicago, was it always the White Sox, or was it also the Cubs?
Great question, and there's a story to it. So I get there, I'm 15 years into the streak that I really wasn't thinking too much about it and realized it was over. It was a baseball team within 100 miles. When I befriend a guy my freshman year, who later was the best man at my wedding, Craig Cheval, who had the two things that are the most important in life. An interest in baseball, a team, and a car. And so Craig, on opening day, 1979, off we go to see his team, the Chicago White Sox. And the White Sox played the Toronto Blue Jays that day. The Blue Jays were only in their second year of existence. And the Blue Jays were awful, and the White Sox were worse, and the weather was horrible. But the one thing that kept me interested and kindled my interest in the White Sox was this drunk broadcaster with a beer in one hand and a microphone in the other, named Harry Caray, leaning out of the White Sox press box saying, "Take me out to the ball game." This was great. It was Wrigley, Comiskey Park was very different than anything I'd experienced at that point in my life with RFK and Memorial Stadium in Baltimore. So I really fell more in love with Harry than the White Sox. So when he defected to the north side, I said to Craig, "Let's go, opening day at Wrigley, Harry." He said, "I'm not going to Wrigley Field." I didn't realize that this North and South Civil War in Chicago was a real thing. So I found a Cubs friend. By that point, I'm now a senior in college, and let's go to Wrigley Field. So I did. So it was two stadiums, Comiskey and Wrigley, over 4 years. I also, Pete, throw in a bonus chapter in 1981 because I happened to go to the re-opener after that miserable 50-game strike in the middle of the 1981 season. So there we are at Comiskey Park. Felt like opening day. There hadn't been a game there in months. Pretty full house. Weather was miserable. It was just like opening day. So we've got 5 chapters in Chicago.
Okay, great. So I'm going to ask a few more questions, but if folks out there have one, raise your hand. There's a raise hand function that helps me see you and identify you. And in the meantime, I'll just ask a few more questions that I have. When we had dinner, I got a little bit more of your backstory. I didn't realize that you had a connection with Charlie Brotman. This meeting that we're doing right now is virtual, certainly since the pandemic started, but it used to be in person. And 1 year, I just checked the schedule, 2010, we actually had this Talking Baseball meeting in Charlie Brotman's basement in his house in Langley Park.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, boy, that was something, besides being an opening day announcer and, having his sports connection, he was also very well connected politically. And that basement was truly amazing. It was not a wall, a piece of wall space could be seen. Everything was covered by photos of him with politicians, Frank Sinatra. It was just amazing. And then I think he had a bar made out of baseball bats, and he had bowls of baseballs, that were signed by teams, and you could just pick these baseballs up and like, oh, it's the, 64 Senators or something. It was just truly incredible experience. So why don't you tell us a little bit about working with Charlie Brotman? He's still with us, isn't he?
He is. In fact, I had the privilege a few months ago, his daughter Debbie pulled together a virtual 94th birthday party for Charlie. And I'm looking at this screen. I saved a couple of screenshots of it because it was that impressive. Think of the people that admire and were friends with Charlie. I almost fell out of place. I worked for the man for a few years, but there was Sugar Ray Leonard, there was Frank Herzog, there was Johnny Holiday, there was Pat Collins. It was just tremendous to see the outpouring of love for a man that's touched so many and been a part of so many lives over these years. I went in the winter of break of 1979-80. There was a Notre Dame summer jobs night in Washington, D.C., and I went and told the PR desk there that I wanted to work in sports public relations. And the guy looked at me like I was crazy. He said, there's only one place you can do that, and that's Charlie Brotman. So I wrote to Charlie Brotman, and he said, I don't hire people. You come work for me, you work for free. And I did. Charlie was notoriously cheap, and it's comical. So the summer of 1980, I interned for him. Summer of 81, I went back on one condition. I said, I'll work the Kemper Open and these others, but you have to pay me. I think he paid me $200. It was a matter of principle. And then when I graduated in 82, I graduated on Saturday and started working full-time for Charlie on Monday. And spent about a year and a half with him, just a wonderful time. But when the Home Team Sports cable channel came along, they wanted me to handle their PR. And so I left Charlie at that point, but we stayed in touch ever since. And it's just a very funny guy.
Yeah, I guess when we were there in 2010, he must have been 82, and now he's 94. That's amazing. Does he still live there in Langley Park?
He now lives in Leisure World.
Oh, really? Okay.
I'll tell you another funny story. Charlie now he's pretty active in email, but I'm not sure he's always paying attention to what's happening in email. He sends an email out to 3 people, and one of whom I don't know. And it was a joke. I don't remember what it was. But I realized that the other person on the distribution list was Mark Lerner, owner of the Nationals, who I've been trying to get in touch with and get a copy of the book to for a while. So I seized that email and sent an email, said, I'd love to give you a copy of the book. And his administrative assistant called me right back and said, he'd love to have it. Here's the address, send it to me right away. So yes, Charlie is well connected even today.
That's fantastic. Walt, you have a question. Please go ahead.
Yeah, come off mute, Walt. Walt's still on mute.
Okay. Not really a question. Michael was very generous enough to share a copy of the book with me. And when I was preparing the last squibber, and I spent about 7 weeks reading it, because this is just, I'm just going to give you a rave review. It is a terrific book. And the best thing about the book is you could have used all of your space talking about 50 games that people could read about almost anywhere else. It's the stories and the individual anecdotes, which are topics about general interest of baseball, but they're from your perspective. I mean, it makes it a very personal book, and those are by far the best part of the book, in my opinion. All those topics, whether it's Curt Flood, I didn't think I could learn something about Caray I didn't already know. But the anecdote about him and Hank Stram, when the 1 year that Yaz played in Notre Dame, I maybe I heard it once, but I didn't recall ever knowing it. It really is just, and it's a book you can pick up and put down, because each year stands as a separate entity. You know, you can read about Curt Flood today and Charlie Brotman later, but I just, I wanted to congratulate you. It's a tremendous book.
Thank you, Walt. That really means a lot. I appreciate it very much.
All right, Dick Adams, I saw you had your hand raised, so why don't you go ahead? You need to unmute first. Dick, you need to unmute yourself.
Dick can't hear you. Dick can't hear you. You have to unmute, Dick. There we go.
Okay,
Start over.
I missed something before I make the comment I had my hand raised for. I missed something about whose house were you in where they had the baseball bats, a bar made of baseball bats.
That was Charlie Brotman.
Who?
Charlie Brotman. He used to announce for the Washington Senators. He was the voice of the presidential inaugurations for years and years.
Okay, I just never knew. Okay. I want to comment, Michael, on your book. You did something most of us would love to do, and I envy you for it. You went and took your life and you poured it out into a book. That's beautiful. That's absolutely beautiful. I think every one of us would like to do something like that. And it gives me ideas. I'm a great idea person. I was looking at my White Sox hats this morning, and it doesn't fit me because my head's too big. I said to her, once you get above an 8, you can't get a hat. You gotta run by it somewhere. I said, that gives me a great idea for selling hats. I said, I'm an idea person. That's all I do is crank out ideas. I don't actually do the work. I just come up with ideas for it. And this just gives me this great idea of how much you could do within SABR of this kind of book and other chapters. And it's beautiful.
Well, you know, it's when I went to San Diego, I told you I met a man who's been to 53 opening days in San Diego. We are talking about the possibility of doing one of these with local editions. Opening day 50 for 50, Pittsburgh Pirates edition, Boston Red Sox edition, New York Yankees edition. So instead of being, might happen to go to 3 cities and different teams and so forth, but in every city in America, there's somebody who is a locker room attendant, a vendor, a groundskeeper, a fan, who's been to something like 50 straight opening days. And they have their own stories. And their, you know, their story, the San Diego steroid story might be about Ken Caminiti, or the New York Yankees one might be about Alex Rodriguez. But there's a way to take some of the evergreen material that's in my book and apply it locally to every team in America. And so I think that would be a fun project. And now that I know more about SABR, which I didn't really know about when I was writing this book, I think there's probably a good synergy to be had there. Good suggestion.
Beautiful.
All right. So Mike, one question I'd like to ask, I think it yields some interesting answers, is as you were doing this, what's the most interesting rabbit hole you fell down? Something you didn't know and something you maybe would like to learn more about.
I told Judy Pace Flood, by far the biggest rabbit hole was Curt Flood, because I knew he was the opening day center fielder for the Senators. I know he challenged the reserve clause. I know he lost. I did not know the breadth and depth of his story. And every time I would watch another documentary on YouTube, or one thing I watched 3 times was Ken Burns' documentary Baseball, including the 10th inning, the sequel he did in 2010. Curt Flood is in there just very, very passionately and eloquently explaining what motivated him. I tried to bang out every chapter, the first draft anyway, about a day or 2 per chapter. I couldn't get off Curt Flood for 3 weeks because his story is so rich, all the way up through Garrett Cole signing this big contract with the Yankees, thanking Marvin Miller and Curt Flood for doing what they did to allow him to sign a $340 million contract with the Yankees. The selflessness of this man who had lots of demons and lots of issues, but really became an obsession. And I had to finally stop and say, okay, pencils down. I got to move on to 1972. Dave McNally, by the way, was equally selfless. And he was the opening day starter for the Orioles 2 years later. He turned down a bribe from the Montreal Expos to allow his name to continue to be on that case, the arbitration case, the Peter Seitz case that ultimately resulted in the end of the reserve clause as we knew it then in the cases of player salaries. But Curt Flood, biggest rabbit hole for sure.
That's very interesting. Have you read Brad Snyder's book about him, the Well-Paid Slave book?
I'm not.
I haven't either, and that's pretty high on my list.
One thing I couldn't do while writing the book was pause and read other books, or else I would never have gotten it done. I will tell you, I even kept them here today. There are a couple.
Just a quick thing, I have read it, and Brad Snyder is one of the other authors who has addressed this group in the past as well. Well-Paid Slave's a really good book.
Wasn't he at SABR 50? Wasn't he up there on the panel with Judy Pace?
It may have been, I wasn't, so I don't know.
That's another great panel, and again, it's on the SABR website. Go listen.
Yeah. Yes, he was on that panel.
I thought so.
Yes. Mhm.
I thought so.
All right, Larry, please go ahead with your question.
Yes, thanks, Pete. Mike, I just wanted to let you know that I heard you on the Lost Ballparks podcast a couple of weeks ago. I've been listening to them recently, and you sounded so interesting. And I was just prepared to go out and get the book, but then I saw you were going to be on here, so I said, well, let me listen to him again. And I'm ready to run out the door to buy this book. I tell you, it's fascinating. And what you were mentioning about people having their own streaks in different cities. Well, I didn't have one like that, but I did. I grew up in Pittsburgh. I'm fortunate I grew up when they were winning. But one of the things I did in high school and college is I was a vendor at the ballpark. So I actually spent opening day at Forbes Field and Three Rivers Stadium. Actually, the actual opening day of Three Rivers Stadium, and but nowhere, and then later in my life, I had traveled around when I did vacations, always would pop into a ballpark, and I was so close to getting to see all the ballparks, and then they built all these new ones, so I couldn't catch up, and I gave up on that. So I admire you for getting to 50 games.
I've been to about 30 ballparks, and half of them have been torn down. So
Yeah.
Interesting. I was looking for these 50 streak people, and there's one in Pittsburgh. I found a English professor at Duquesne.
Okay.
He's been a ticket taker at every Pirates opening day for 52 years or something like that.
Yeah. Well, when I started in 67, I guess was the first time I worked. I had been to probably 1 or 2 opening games before I was old enough to be a vendor. But when I first do that, I met some vendors. I could swear they were there in the early 30s. So, the time parable is like really interesting when you look back at it.
Speaking of the Pirates, I posted last night on LinkedIn and Facebook a tribute to Roberto Clemente.
No.
Because yesterday was the 50th anniversary of his 3,000th hit, as many of you know. And as I was going through my baseball card collection recently, kind of getting it organized to move on, I found my 1969 Roberto Clemente baseball card, which I gave to my Puerto Rican neighbor who idolized him as a child. But the card wasn't Roberto Clemente. It was Bob Clemente.
Bob, yes.
Because in those days, we pressured you to Americanize yourself, which...
And Bob Prince, the announcer, used to call him Bobby.
Bobby, I know. I listened to the 3,000th hit on YouTube last night. But that was then. This is now, and deserves a lot of recognition.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Just a comment about that celebration in Pittsburgh yesterday. Part of that ceremony was the dedication of a marker. I think it's in the parking lot of where second base used to be in the old Three Rivers Stadium. And that was done, plug for SABR here, that was done in conjunction with a new program SABR's introduced, the local grants program, where they work with chapters and other interested parties to facilitate efforts to put historical markers up and whatever. So if you go up there, there's now I guess a virtual base base in where second base was, and that was part of that ceremony yesterday.
What was their motive on second base? Was it because of steals or because his 3,000th hit was a double, or why second base?
I think his 3,000th hit was a double.
Yeah,
That's where he ended up on the last game of the season. And of course, we know what happened the following New Year's. So I think everyone was happy that he got that hit in his last at bat there.
Off of Jan Matlack.
Yeah.
And Willie Mays came over from the visiting dugout to congratulate him.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. People forget Willie ended his career with the Mets.
So when we were talking before, you mentioned briefly here being a young Senators fan when they left. something we share. I'm maybe a year or two older than you, but certainly I was a big Senators fan. I felt like my guts had been punched when they moved away. So why don't you talk about that? And I think you mentioned you were also at that last game.
I was, and bring that to life a lot. When I went to the first, during the 33-year hiatus, I couldn't bring myself to go to one of those old timer games or exhibition games at RFK. It just wasn't. I remember vividly being there with my dad on September 30th, 1971, when all hell broke loose, and I wanted to run on the field like everybody else, and Dad said it was too dangerous. And I tell the story in the book. And 30 to 25 years later, I guess, I bring my 11-year-old son to the last Redskins game at RFK Stadium, and they beat Dallas that day, and all hell breaks loose. And I said to my son, "Let's go out on the field and tear up some turf." He said, "No, Dad, it's too dangerous." Went full circle. But having been at that last Senators game, and to be at the first Nationals game, and that bridge of time made that pregame ceremony so emotional and so amazing. You know, and it gets very frustrating. I stop in chapter 1998 or 99-ish, whenever the Tampa Bay Devil Rays came to Baltimore. Jose Canseco and Wade Boggs and that team. And that was kind of the last straw. This is getting crazy. Tampa's got a team, and we can't get one back in Washington. Charlie Brotman was very instrumental in trying for years with Andy Ockershausen and others to try to stir up interest in various places. But as Tom Boswell rightly pointed out in one of his columns that I quote in the book, baseball is using Washington until the time is right, because they can leverage Washington every time somebody wants a new stadium. You need a new stadium in San Francisco, threaten to move to Washington. You need one in Chicago, threaten to move to Washington. We got used for 3 decades, but getting baseball back, eventually winning the World Series, just an amazing thing. I did save my ticket stubs, and they're on the companion website from that last game. And I put them in the John McNamara chapter because his widow, Andrea, gave me John's ticket stub from that last Senators game. John and I didn't meet each other until 4 years later, but we were both the same kind of people that save our ticket stubs from meaningful, important games, including that last Senators game. Really, really memorable night. And when we went back in 2005 for that first game, I got there 3 or 4 hours early and made my kids go with me to the seats we sat in for that last Senators game that my dad and I did it. This is where it all ended. And now let's go upstairs where it's going to begin again. There were only 14,000 of us there for that last Senators game, although I think 50,000 people claim they were there. It was an intimate crowd. I can't imagine there's more than a couple hundred of us that were at both.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So I was struck, when we talked before, and you mentioned it here again today, about how, you were familiar with SABR, but didn't think that it was something that you could be a part of, because you're not some, baseball wizard, trivia expert or whatever. And yet now you've kind of come 180 degrees on that. So, I guess there's no question. I was just really struck by that. It's truly amazing. I think what it points out is if there's anyone listening here and you're not sure about whether you should be a member or could be a member, you certainly could be, and whether you are is your own decision. But I think I would speak from my experience, and I think you would probably chime in that it's a great thing for the individual, and something that's been very valuable to us in our lives. You for a short amount of time, but me for a little bit longer.
I'll tell you a side story that's relevant. Sometimes we just miss the obvious in life. Okay, it was probably right in front of me every time I went to the SABR website. Join here, and I just missed it. Charlie Brotman, we worked for the United States Football League's Washington Federals for their 2 seasons in Washington. And I remember before the very first game, it was going to be the Chicago Blitz with George Allen coming back to RFK Stadium to play the Washington Federals. And we're having the meeting with their executives a week before the game. And Charlie, in his unique style, says, "Who's bringing the football?" The point being, do we have the obvious taken care of here? Like, what are we're all talking about these big brainy things, and we kind of miss the obvious sometimes. And that's exactly what happened with me and SABR. I just missed the obvious. So glad to be on board.
Good. You mentioned finally being able to get a book to Mark Lerner, kind of through that, unexpected avenue through Charlie Brotman. So who else are you trying to get in touch with?
I want to do more with the Nationals. I think it was kind of clumsy this past April because of the lockout, because of Masson wasn't letting their announcers go to Florida. So I tried to go down and see Bob Carpenter, for example, and he wasn't here because Masson was keeping him off the road. I did spend time with Dave Jagler and Charlie Slows, but I do want to do more with the Nationals. As I mentioned earlier, it wasn't even on Amazon for 3 weeks. So while I had been on MLB Network, for example, I haven't really done much. I was on an Orioles pregame show on Masson, but I haven't done much in Washington yet. I think in general, that's going to be, I do want to relaunch the book this spring because we cut it too close last year, again, because of the lockout and other things. And let's just get this back out there. More reviews, like thank you, Walt, for your kind words earlier. Things like that start coming out. I think we'll get to some more traction. Being a self-publishing, I will never, ever self-publish again. One great takeaway from SABR 50 was walking around a room where there are 7 companies that specialize in publishing baseball books. If only I had known. But we learn.
Well, I think the point of self-publishing is to have a good enough book that you don't need to self-publish next time, that there's people out there that want to work with you.
Yeah, it's true. And I gave copies to them and said, tell me what you think. And the feedback's been good. They don't want to get on board now because they think, and they're right, the big chunk of activity has been sucked out in year 1. There's not enough in it for them to get on board for next spring. And that's fine. I've thought about changing publishers midstream, but that's not going to happen.
Okay. You mentioned your daughter-in-law helping with the website, and I was when I was researching the book before this meeting, looked at the website. It's very slick and very polished. So kudos to her.
And Peter, thank you. I'll pass that along. Peter Coolball reached out to me yesterday, the Babe Ruth chapter head, and said, since you're so good at websites, can you help us build our chapter website? I said, I know nothing about websites. My daughter-in-law, on the other hand, she's terrific, but she works for a company. She did this as a side hustle for me. And it's a big body of work, and she did a terrific job. I'll pass your comments along.
Maybe you touched on this, but as you've published and sent the book out to people, and you had a chance, you showed us pictures you had taken with people as you were introducing the books to them. You've met a lot of people. So who is the most exciting person for you personally to meet finally?
Oh, Frank Howard for sure.
Frank Howard. Okay.
I reached out to a friend who knew him, and I said, it's time. My connection to Frank Howard is so long and so deep. To be able to go to his home and sit down and talk baseball with him for an hour. If you've ever met Frank, you know that there's one topic Frank will not talk about, and that's Frank Howard.
Right.
But everything else is time with the Yankees. And Frank Howard hit, my first vivid memory of a Senators game was my birthday, 1969. Against the Seattle Pilots, Frank Howard hits a colossal home run off of Jim Bouton. And that kind of is here. When my dad's law office in Washington, D.C. was right above Rinaldi's Cleaners. And old man Rinaldi would be the recipient every day of the uniforms of the Senators and the away teams. He would launder them and then send them back over to RFK for the next day's game. Well, one Saturday morning in 1969, I got to go down to my dad's office. I forget why. And Mr. Rinaldi says, hey, son, come here. And he puts Reggie Jackson's jersey on this 9-year-old little boy. And it was bigger than I was. And if you remember, the A's jerseys in those days were vests, they were sleeveless. So fortunately, my arms were sticking out through the holes, or else you would have known I was in there. And Frank Howard's jersey. So when Phil Wood reads that mention in the book, he says, I can help you with that Frank Howard 1969 jersey. So what are you talking about? He said, I have one in my collection. You talk about Charlie Brotman's basement. Phil Wood's got quite a collection of jerseys and other memorabilia. So he lends it to me. My wife and I go down to Nats Park where the statue of Frank Howard is. And there's a picture on the website of me wearing a 1969 Frank Howard jersey, staring up at the statue of my idol. Pete, to meet Frank Howard finally. Frank Howard showed up on opening day in my journey 3 times as a coach for the visiting team. Just for the Mets, for the Brewers, and for the Rays. just happened to be there. It was uncanny. And I was at the ceremony when he was inducted to the Ring of Honor at Nats Park. So it's just, that was by far the top of the list. Reconnecting with Al Bumbry after 48 years and him agreeing to that picture in that place, it was just a bizarre coincidence and really a nice conversation.
All right, great. You mentioned maybe working with, it sounds like you're going to franchise your idea here to other places. Also talking about relaunching the book, but what's next for you?
Those are the two keys. I mean, one of the other frustrations of self-publishing is you don't know how you've done. You know that Amazon has said you're #1 bestseller for a hot minute. That's great. And you market that. And Barnes & Noble says you're bestseller. That's great. It's a very narrow category called baseball history. I still have no idea how many we sold. I won't know for another couple of weeks. It's that big, ridiculous a lag. Now, I'm in a position where I'm able to afford this work and do it this way, but boy, it's got to be tough. When I find out how it did, I'll be able to make a more informed decision about franchising and doing more books like this. I won't self-publish again, but as was mentioned earlier, I think at least the marketing success of this book will be enough to get baseball book publishers interested in doing something more with me in the future. It's a passion and I love doing it. As I said to my wife from the get-go, I don't know if anybody's going to buy it. I don't know if anyone's going to read it, but I'm going to have fun writing it. And I did. And what's happened since has been gravy and it's been wonderful.
So you mentioned where people can get it. If someone wanted an autographed copy, how could they work with you to get that?
Email me, we'll work it out. When I'm in Maryland, I'll come to you, or you can come to me, or you can mail it to me. We'll figure something out, but just email me. It's opening day 5050 at gmail.com. Easy to remember. Opening day 5050 at gmail.com. And we'll figure something out. I've done a lot of them that way. People ship them to me, I sign them, or
But again, opening day.
opening day 5050 at gmail.com.
I missed the dot. What comes it? Dot what?
Opening day 5050 at gmail.com.
Spell it.
I'm sorry?
Spell it.
Opening day 5050 at Gmail.
Oh, Gmail. Okay.
Gmail.
Gmail.com.
Yep. Okay.
Absolutely.
All right, good.
Michael, if I could, I'd just like to understand one thing you said just a few minutes ago. Would you not have an idea of how your book did by as a self-published book by the number of sales that Barnes and Noble, for example, reports to you that they've made, or how you have personally been able to sell your book? Why? I guess my question is, why don't you have an idea of how the book is done?
Because I don't have a direct relationship with any of them. My relationship is through my publisher.
Oh,
So I hired a publisher called Mindster Media that stepped in under bizarre circumstances last October and did a good job getting the book to market. But they then in turn engage with Barnes and Noble and Amazon and all of them.
Oh,
So
I
they
see.
get the reporting, and their approach is quarterly reporting from the quarter that ended several months ago. So first quarter, I had no sales.
Okay.
Second quarter didn't end until July 1st. That reporting comes out October 15th. So I will get it then.
Okay, well, thank you. I just wondered about that.
There is one way to track general performance. If you go into Amazon and you dig down to the details that are available for all of you to look at about how a book is doing, you can see where it's ranked within various categories. And in April, we ranked 8,600 out of millions and millions and millions of books. So that's really good. But that could be $3 ebooks, or it could be $20 paperbacks. I don't know.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm going to open it up for one last round, one last call for any questions for Mike. Anyone have anything they want to ask? Okay, Mike, any last words for us?
Thank you so much for your time, your interest, the kind words, great questions. Really appreciate it.
I was wondering real quickly, what your what kind of reaction you got? You got to the book at the convention.
I didn't do a book signing at the convention. It was my first SABR. I was too new. I really didn't feel like I should push myself out there. I was
But-
there to learn,
But
more
did
than I was to sell.
people come up to you and talk about the book? Have they read the book, or what kind of reaction did you get from the people that you talked to?
A few, those that have read it, you've heard today, and it was very similar from people that have read it there. Peter Coolball was on a personal mission to tell people it was wonderful. So I was very, very grateful for Peter's outreach to folks. But
Good.
and Tim Kirkshin had some nice things to say as well. But yeah, I was there more to learn than to push.
All right, Mike. Well, we really appreciate you making time for us. Glad that you and your wife weathered the storm and were able to present to us. We really appreciate it. For everyone, we'll be back next month. I mentioned Saturday, November 5th is the next edition of Talking Baseball, and our guest will be Dan Joseph in his book about Pete Reeser. So appreciate everyone making a time for us today. Stay dry, and we'll see you next month.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.